Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Just another minute. Okay, so it is 11:02. I'll give everyone else a chance to join as we go along, but I do want to get started since we have a lot of information to cover. So good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining. Those who are in attendance, my name is Lilian Jarquin. I will be the moderator for today's webinar, Sunny with a Chance of Forecasting Florida's Economic Resilience. Today, I am joined by my colleagues, Dr. Howard Frank, Center Director, Dr. Ned Murray, Associate Director, Research Specialist Victoria Lerma, and Research Coordinator Alex Almanzar. I will just a couple of ground rules here. I know that there's going to be a chance for questions. I would really appreciate it if everyone included any of those in the Q&A at the bottom and through the Zoom functions. If there's any sort of commentary or anything that is not a question, we could put that in the chat. So without further ado, I will hand it off to Dr. Ned Murray and we'll get started. Dr. Murray, you're muted.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here with us. We're thrilled to be able to roll out the center's new economic resilience project. In some ways, it's the project is new. It did evolve from economic research going back a number of years, dating back to the post-recession and highlighted, as I think some of you know, by the Miami-Dade County Prosperity Study, which created a lot of the thinking about what economic resilience is. And then, of course, we all encountered the COVID pandemic, and it was at that point, as you know, if you've been tracking and our website, we created the Economic Recovery Index post-COVID for 3 years, and that was something that was started in March of 2020. So we learned a lot, not only from the first economic shock, with that being the Great Recession and the economic research that we did post-recession, but we've learned even more after the shock that was provided by the COVID pandemic. So what we're really rolling out now is a body of research, economic research, that the center has done for over 10 years now on economic, not only economic resilience, but economic factors and conditions that relate to that. So that's how we got here. Now the purpose of it is really to provide a policy tool for local governments, and the way we've created this, at least one big element of it is through a dashboard, and we're going to get into that in a few minutes, and Lillian will actually take you through that dashboard that you'll all be able to access and use periodically from this point forward. We started with the 7 most populous counties in the state of Florida, as you can see, but it's important to note that the foundation of the project, in terms of the economic resilience thinking, relates to all local governments, and even if we're looking at economic South Miami-Dade would be a good example of that. So it's going to be applied, at least initially, to the 7 largest counties in the state of Florida. And from there, we can begin looking at other localities as well. So that's the beginning of it. But the most important thing, I think, is that what we're trying to accomplish here is to build some thinking around economic resilience and the foundations for that, which really are 3 pillars. 3 pillars that, and we can show them on the next slide, which are interconnected and foundational to the whole idea of economic resilience. Economic resilience is different than a lot of the economic modeling that's out there, economic modeling that we've done ourselves over the years, looking at economic growth and competitiveness. Obviously, all that is tied into this, but ultimately what we're trying to do here is to create a foundation for policy analysis and for policy implementation that can address the existing economy, the conditions within the existing economy, and then find ways to enhance these 3 important pillars. These pillars are interconnected, as you can see. You need all 3 to be vibrant. You need all 3 to be resilient, and it's a dynamic. So we need to think of this as a dynamic type of economic analysis, and where we will be assessing, at least initially, as I mentioned, the 7 most populated counties in the state of Florida. But we'll be looking for ways, or should I say, monitoring the 7 counties in terms of how they're actually enhancing these 3 pillars in terms of the various indicators, which we're going to get into in more detail. The next slide just provides a quick overview definition of the 3. Once again, the most important point I can get across is how interrelated they are, interconnected they are, and mutually supporting of one another they are. Diversification is one that comes up a lot. It truly is foundational, I think, in almost any kind of economic growth model, but certainly when we look at diversification, we are thinking in terms of various industries, various wage sectors, and skills and educational attainment that is really, really critical to not only growing an economy, but providing a lot of the opportunities that are necessary to build that level of resilience. Stability is one that came up as we found after the Great Recession, that having a stable economy and all the various indicators that tie into that is really critical and oftentimes overlooked. And so this gets into indicators such as vitality, affordability obviously has become a big issue, not only in terms of housing, but inflation in general since COVID. But a lot of other aspects of local economies and socioeconomic types of conditions that are really critical and foundational, once again, to economic resilience. And the 3rd pillar is prosperity. And this has really come to the forefront, certainly post-recession, but we really saw this play out, as you all know, in the early days of COVID, in terms of who was getting hit the hardest, in terms of loss of jobs, but also other socioeconomic factors that we saw play out and highlighted in the early months and in the first year of the COVID pandemic. So prosperity is absolutely critical, and it's really something that we want to get into a little more detail on as well, and we will this morning, because this is that critical foundational pillar that provides for that, the opportunity, mobility, and equity that is often downplayed or just not addressed sufficiently in a lot of economic growth models. So with that, we've got more detail on all of this, including a lot of the data indicators that I mentioned. So we're going to begin by my colleague, Howard Frank, focusing in on the first pillar, diversification, and providing a discussion on that. Thank you.
Ned, thank you. Thank you for making me the leadoff hitter on this part of the tripod of pillars here. So good morning, everyone. And I think anybody who's taken a personal finance course would know that people are often told to invest in mutual funds or exchange traded funds rather than buy individual stocks. Why? Because you have far less risk. If any one company does badly, your investment will survive or do well down the road. And the same applies to economies. Diversity generally helps, and they are more survivable, whether it's an economic downturn or a natural disaster, or as we saw with COVID, a health disaster or a supply chain setback. Diversity is generally associated with positive economic activity and growth for an area. We have, you can see a number of indicators went into this metric, and you know, we did it as an industrial slice, so to speak, the job postings, churn rate, and the skills looked for being among the most important. But again, we, in building this pillar, we examined a lot of disaggregated data within number of categories. Moving ahead, again, what did these data reveal? And I can tell you, I could have chosen 20 important factors or things to look at. There's a wealth of data, and Lillian will show you later in our presentation how to dive in and look at them. But here were four that, you know, in the interest of time, kind of stuck out. One is that restaurant employment is the biggie, 7 to 10% across Florida, and that's in the state and in all of the metro areas we examined. And of course, if you recall, during COVID recently, that sector was very, very hard hit. And anyone who's been in South Florida over the past years would know when there's a downturn, that is a hard hit sector. Finance makes it to the top 5 in Hillsborough and Duval, but it is not in any of the other metro areas. Again, you know, that's an interesting one to think through historically, and it could reflect many things, including consolidation in the banking sector. It could mean that more and more banking is online, things like SoFi, but finance is not a big sector, generally speaking, in the state. And even though we're living in an era of information technology and NVIDIA and AI, you know, seemingly in any news broadcast, it's interesting that when it comes to job skills, statewide, first or second in the state and in the metro areas. Being able to communicate is important. I was looking last night, they were some references. Yes, AI is important, but AI cannot demonstrate empathy or soft skills. So there's still use for the ability to communicate and write. That's still a top skill sought after by employers. Interestingly, IT is 7th statewide, and in most of the metro areas, it's not in the top 5. It's one of the lower 5. In terms of educational achievement, Palm Beach and Orange have the highest baccalaureate achievement level, which is in the low 30%, and that's better than the state, which is somewhere around 30%. Where does it all lead to, or what does it lead to? Well, my takeaways, food for thought. Actually, Miami has a fairly diversified economy. but our concentrations are in low wage sectors that are susceptible to economic shocks. New York and Denver are more concentrated, but they are concentrated in high wage, less susceptible sectors. New York being a finance hub, Denver increasingly an IT hub. When you look at the jobs created, it mirrors national trends, which is we have a lot of job creation at the low end and then relatively few at the high end, but mid-wage jobs, not a lot of creation there. And I think from an ultimate bottom line perspective, South Florida and Florida in general, how can leaders and policy makers maintain a healthy tourist sector, but then broaden out to things like healthcare, manufacturing, technology, and education? That really is the needle that they need to thread. So with that, I'm going to turn the baton. I'll pass the baton to Victoria Lerma, who is going to talk about stability.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. This pillar, economic stability, is foundational to economic resilience because it is the main way that most of us interact with the economy on a daily basis: the housing market, job market, and cost of living. Metrics for the housing market include median single-family home sales price, median rent estimates, and foreclosure rates for every 10,000 housing units. For the job market, we are looking at the unemployment rate as well as two seasonal metrics: the year-over-year percent change in the size of the labor force and employed population. And finally, for the cost of living, we are looking at the consumer price index. Moving on, what does the data show? The data shows that median rent increased in South Florida from the last quarter of 2023 to the first quarter of 2024. The greatest increases in Broward at 1.9% and Miami at 1.3%. When we take a bigger picture and analyze these rent figures in 2 years, from the first quarter of 2022 to the first quarter of 2024, without accounting for inflation, we see that the greatest increase was Miami-Dade at 3.7% and Broward at 2.5%. For reference, the inflation rate in March of 2022 was 8.5% compared to 3.5% in March of 2024. These are national inflation figures. Thus, it seems rent is increasing despite decreasing inflation. Notwithstanding, the cost of living has increased in all areas studied during the time period studied, with the highest consistently being for South Florida, the counties of Miami, Broward, and Palm Beach. To give you an idea, the consumer price index in the first quarter of this year for the South Florida MSA was 345.2, while that of the state of Florida was 304.5, and the U.S. city average was 312.2. So we are seeing that the South Florida MSA has a higher cost of living than the state and the nation. For unemployment rates, we see that they are at 3.5% or below in all the counties measured on the state. And this is lower than the national average of 3.8% in the first quarter of this year. Miami-Dade had the lowest unemployment rate of the areas we studied at 2%. However, before we start jumping for joy, that could be a sign of labor force changes and underlying demographic factors, including a negative net domestic migration, that are affecting these employment and unemployment rates. In terms of foreclosures, we studied rates of list pendants and REOs for every 10,000 housing units. List pendants is the formal process that begins foreclosures. And for list pendants, we see that they fell off during the pandemic, but recently picked up. In fact, from the fourth quarter of 2021 to the second quarter of 2023, the rate of list pendants for every 10,000 housing units increased in all areas, with the highest increase in Duval County. Duval went from 5 foreclosures for every 10,000 housing units to 13.3. when analyzing national level data, we see that properties with foreclosure filings represented 0.26% of all U.S. housing units in 2023, up from 0.23% the previous year. Next slide, please. So what does the data mean? Well, for starters, we should view Florida not as one homogeneous, unified economy, but rather as a mosaic of different regional economies with different cost of living situations, housing situations, and employment situations. South Florida has very low unemployment rates, lower than the national average, but this is a tight labor market that might hinder business and economic growth. This makes recruitment and retention of employees more difficult. We learned about this in our Greater Miami Chamber of Commerce survey, that we conducted earlier this year. We found that most employers in Miami-Dade reported an increase in resignations over the last 2 years, with 38.9% reporting a slight increase in resignations and 16.1% reporting a significant increase. Another interesting fact and policy implication is that the cost of living is extremely high, as we can see in the high consumer price index, the high housing costs, and many locals are moving out and being replaced by individuals and families with higher median income and higher levels of educational attainment. When we analyzed Census Plum's data, we looked at, for the state of Florida, where people were residing 1 year prior. We found that those who came from a home in a different state had a median income of $124,000 versus those who came from a home in another part of Florida, $99,000, and those who remained in their home from the year prior, $108,000. When looking at educational attainment for this same population, we see that 43.8% of those who came from another state had a bachelor's degree or higher, compared to 34.8% of those who came from another home in Florida and 33.8% of those who remained in their same home. Thus, we're seeing, yes, we have a low unemployment rate, but for those who are employed, are the wages enough to be able to afford such a high cost of living? And with that, I will transition to my colleague, Alex Almanzar.
Thank you, Vicky, and thank you everybody for joining us. So I'm here today to speak about economic prosperity. And while all three of our pillars, as Dr. Murray mentioned, are deeply interconnected and reliant on one another, we decided to place prosperity third in the list because, from our view, prosperity is the ability of individuals and families to leverage the economic stability and diversification that may or may not exist around them. As Dr. Frank often likes to put it, are people living the good life, right? The question for us here is, can they thrive rather than just survive? And are they inching closer to the American dream, right? So some of the metrics that we use to analyze this are average wages by industry, sex, race, and ethnicity, the proportion of businesses employing under 20 people, and actually several others. And if you're more interested in the data, I invite you to explore the dashboard. So next slide, please. We've decided to pull out a few sort of high-level data observations. So for one, the trajectory of housing costs surpasses that of incomes. Just to give you a small sort of excerpt of data to demonstrate that. From 2019 to 2023, housing costs increased significantly for all counties that we observed. Specifically, the median sale price for single-family homes, for example, rose 100+% for most of these counties. Talking hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars increase for each county. As pandemic era economic pressures cooled around mid-2022, only one county saw any real relief in that metric, and that was Pinellas County. But that's not really saying much, because even in that county, families are now paying nearly double at the median level what they would have in 2019 for a single family home. And that's without any consideration of the size, the condition, and the nature of the homes that are actually selling at these price points. So incomes have risen as well, but not nearly fast enough to match that explosive pace that we've witnessed here in Florida. Secondly, we examined Florida's three largest race and ethnic categories, as well as the two sexes. So the top performers in terms of income varied from county to county, but the disparity between Black and African American workers and their local neighbors as well as the disparity between women and men. The disparity between these groups was ubiquitous across all counties that we observed. So, I should note that we think moving forward, there might be some use in measuring the dynamism, the vulnerability, and the elasticity in incomes for these demographic groups. We know from our previous studies, for instance, our work in Boynton Beach, that economic shocks do not hurt everyone equally. So we think there might be something interesting to observe there over time. And lastly, unsurprisingly, pre and post-pandemic, businesses with 19 or fewer employees constitute a significant portion of Florida's economy. Special shout out to Palm Beach County, where in any given quarter, about a quarter of their employees are working at one of these businesses. Next slide, please. So as for what some of the policy implications are for this, well, for one, resiliency measures are needed across the state to ensure that Florida remains accessible to its current populations. Our economy, and we're witnessing this all over the state in many different projects, our economy is becoming further bifurcated into a system of haves and have-nots. The wealthy, and I should note those moving from elsewhere out of the state, are able to prosper just about anywhere in the state, while native workers are frankly running out of places to hide. That is, they are being priced out of their own market. Secondly, an economy that preponderantly creates low-wage jobs also exasperates racial, ethnic, and gender disparities by limiting economic opportunity and mobility. In an economy like Florida's that is service-focused, low-wage intensive, equity and economics are deeply intertwined, and inequity can serve as a potential bottleneck for development and growth. If you're more interested, by the way, in our various approaches to equity and its impact on the workforce and our economies, I'd point you towards our website, where you'll find some really key studies, such as our Palm Beach County Housing Equity Study, our various status of women and gender equity reports, and our twin studies, the state of Black Broward and the state of Hispanic and immigrant Broward. And lastly, as far as policy implications for this go, entrepreneurship alone does not uplift communities, right? I think that we Floridians, and especially South Floridians, we pride ourselves on entrepreneurship, and especially small scale entrepreneurship. But we know from our previous work that traditional funding and support systems underserve these businesses. These types of businesses specifically require an ecosystem that mobilizes and builds their capacity. And also, I'll add, we think there might be an open research question here that asks, what exactly is the impact of these businesses on our economic resiliency? Traditionally, these businesses have been seen as an indicator of activity and opportunity. They're also thought to provide, as we've mentioned before, a certain buffer to economic shocks. But experts that we've spoken with have often noted that this reliance or this focus on small business is often a result of necessity and circumstance rather than a sign of genuine entrepreneurial drive. A similar question, by the way, is out about the job churn rate, another metric that we track. We know that there are standards for what a healthy job churn rate, and excuse me, I should mention, the job churn rate is essentially the rate at which people are leaving and gaining new jobs in any given quarter. So we understand that there are standards for a healthy job churn rate, but it's still not clear whether a rise or a spike in the churn is indicative of opportunity or desperation. And that's something we hope to explore in the quarters moving forward. So with that, I'll pass it back to my colleague, Lilian Martin, who will provide you with some more details and information on the dashboard itself. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Alex. And so you might be asking yourself, well, where are we basing all of this information from? Where are we getting these numbers from? What is this dashboard that we're talking about? What is the precursor, the COVID index? And so I'm showing you all the dashboard, which we're inviting you all to explore. And I will show you all actually how it should work. So you'll see the link at the top if you wanted to see it at some point. If you can confirm that we're seeing my screen. Perfect. So this is the home screen of the Georgian Press Economic Resilience Dashboard. As mentioned, here are the three pillars to the right: economic stability, economic prosperity, economic diversification. And as a little reminder, there's a little tidbit at the top of each one of these navigation buttons. So, for example, we heard about the housing market, we heard about CPI, that can be found under the economic stability navigation. We heard about race and gender, as well as standard of living. That would be under prosperity. And then we also heard about educational attainment, job skills, job market diversification. That would naturally be under the economic diversification navigation. To the left, you will see a map of Florida. As mentioned, we are looking at the seven most populous counties in Florida. If you hover over these, you'll see those exact populations. This is based off of the US Census Bureau's estimates. So these include all of South Florida. This includes Hillsborough and Pinellas, Orange, Duval, and all of state of Florida, where the data is applicable. And just to give you all a brief walkthrough, before I do all of that, there is a little navigation at the top with detailed instructions that you'll see another video. If you click on that, you can just hit play on this and you'll get a very detailed explanation on each one of these pages. So that being said, I can show you all economic stability. If we just get a quick second to reconnect, we'll go into economic stability, which again mentioned, this is what you're seeing here is housing details. The colors in the previous map correspond with the colors that you're seeing here on the screen. So right here, so at the top chart is median and home sale price. So currently we have this chart set to median rent estimates. So if you hover over any one of these bars, it'll show you exactly what we're looking at. So right now the filters, which you can use to select any one of the geographies that we mentioned, any one of the years that we mentioned, and any one of the quarters that we mentioned, since this is this data is quarterly, this is quarterly data. So for example, so in this bar right here, so we'll see that the median rent estimates for Miami-Dade County in the fourth quarter of 2023 was $1,798. Conversely, the median rent estimates for Palm Beach in 2019 in the fourth quarter was 1,360. Of course, this was right before COVID. So you'll see even a bigger jump if you wanted to compare to the fourth quarter of 2021, which is 1,892. Now, if we switch this out to median single family home sale price, that will update. And so you'll see, so for example, if you wanted to look at a median home sale price for nostalgic purposes of Miami-Dade County in 2019, in the fourth quarter, the median home sale price in that moment in time was $375,000. Now jumping forward to the fourth quarter of 2021 in Miami-Dade County, that is $5,280. And you can follow that same process here, just provided a little bit of a detail there. So when we're looking at foreclosure data, so this bottom chart will show that foreclosure data that my colleague Vicky mentioned, with the list pendants, with the real estate owned properties. Same idea, same concept. You can switch between the two, and this will have a separate set of filters as the data is different and they provide different data points. That being said, you will always have a detailed explanation towards the top. We can go into the seasonal data. I won't do too much of a walkthrough there. This is what we mentioned previously, percent change in size of the labor force, percent change in employed population. This one has a different breakdown when you hover over the bars, since this is a year over year to quarter presentation. And just again, this is just like a little brief introduction. I don't mean to overwhelm everyone with all this information, but just to bring everyone back to the main page, you can always, the top right navigation will always bring you back to the previous page. The same can be said for economic prosperity. Now the colors here will be a little bit different because it's showing sex and race. But if I want to just, for purposes of showing how to bring everyone back, it will always be the top right navigation button, and you'll always see where you're going. So you'll always see where you're going, and you'll always have these detailed instructions. And so I will stop sharing here and I will bring it back to my panelists. I see that we have a few questions. So are we able to share slides? Yes, of course, will we posted? Yes. And will we keep the dashboard URL on the chat? I will share that with everyone just now. All right, so I see that we still have a few minutes for discussion. I can open it back up. I know Dr. Frank had a couple of thoughts that maybe we didn't cover in the slide, in our slide deck. So if you'd like to take it away and kick off those talking points. You are currently muted, so.
No, I'm happy to yield the floor. I'd like to hear really, what questions from our audience. I'd like to hear what questions they might have.
Please feel free to ask any questions. We are here to answer.
see. There's something in the chat.
Let's see, yes, so I just put the link for our dashboard. But if anyone else, here we go. So I see there's a question from John Brown who asks, how can we balance the increase in rent with low wages? And I open that up to anyone on our panel.
Well, I'll start by saying, as a class, I think local economies that have a heavy tourist component, high rents tend to be sadly typical. And I think, you know, we're now having some demographic changes and this inflow of very high income people that exacerbate a longstanding problem. And my gut says, and I think our research would say that there has to be thought to different housing policies to the extent that's possible. But I also think it gets down to economic-based changes that have a higher wage trajectory, that we need to think about how this economy morphs and matures and becomes less dependent on its low wage base.
Yeah, and I will say this, I mean, the direct answer to that question is that there is no relationship between rents and wages, particularly in South Florida. I think as we've done, I think many of you know, the center has done a number of housing studies over the past few years in a number of different counties and municipalities. And this issue comes up, of course, a lot, particularly over the last 2 years. The first thing I think is we have to recognize, and that's why this resilience project is so important, that like it or not, Florida's economy is based on 2 major industry sectors: tourism and hospitality, and healthcare. Most of the occupations within those 2 industries are low wage. But those industries provide our economic base, essentially. So they have to be strengthened and nurtured. But that doesn't help a lot when we start thinking in terms of housing costs, because obviously there's such a gap between what people earn and what rents are, or for that matter, home prices. So that's where the whole notion of the demand side of the equation comes in. Those are supply issues that need to be addressed through economic diversification, prosperity, all the pillars that we spelled out. And how does that happen? Well, it does happen through economic diversity, and it has to happen through economic diversity, because it's not going to change. It's not like rents are going to go back down. We know they've softened a bit as far as increases. Housing costs have stayed pretty stable now, but in many ways, the horse is already out of the barn. We are at levels, both in terms of rents and housing costs, that far exceed the incomes of our resident workforce in all our counties, not just here in South Florida, but elsewhere. So the only answer to that from a demand side of the equation is to improve upon our local economies, provide more opportunities, not just in terms of the jobs themselves, but the education and workforce development that's so critical to that. So there's a number of things that have to happen there. In the meantime, obviously, there's going to have, as Dr. Frank just mentioned, policies, programs put in place that address those gaps. And those gaps are huge, so that's going to be difficult because there's only so much money around through the state and the federal government to do that. But there has to be programs in place as well in the interim while we build our local economies. But that's what this economic resilience project is really all about, is how do we look forward? How do we begin to strengthen our economies and create these opportunities, and at the same time create more affordable housing, but also improve the overall quality of life of our residents. So all of this has to play out, but this is an attempt that we're trying to put forward, is to begin to take it into account, to assess it, monitor it, and hopefully enhance it.
Thank you. And so I wanted to add on to that as a sort of follow-up. I know Dr. Murray alluded to it a little bit, but a similar question from Laverne Parks asks, any one of us who wants to answer, when will the housing market, where will the housing market be, I'm sorry, in the next 2 to 3 years in terms of cost?
Well, I guess I kind of just answered that. I don't think there's anybody that foresees anything similar to what we went through in 2007 and 2008. There will not be a bubble burst, but we will see some leveling off. But as I said, that doesn't help us a whole lot in terms of where we're at right now in terms of rents and home prices, and the fact that we're just not building in enough housing. What's being built, of course, through low income housing tax credits on the rental side, and what's being preserved in some cases, that's helping, but there just isn't enough money being funneled through the federal government and the state, even though that has increased in the last couple of years at the state level. It's just not enough. Miami-Dade alone could use all the money that's coming out of the state coffers, and think about that in terms of all the other counties that have those needs. So I guess unlike 2008 and 9, where we saw rents, well, not so much rents did go down a bit, but mainly home prices. We're not going to see it in the next couple of years, or for that matter. It's just not going to happen unless there's a total collapse of the Florida economy. But we don't, and hopefully that will not occur. But I think we have to recognize, and that's where the policy analysis comes in, and the policy implementation comes in, is how do we address this huge gap that exists right now in terms of housing and income, and there's a number of things that can happen there, both from the supply and demand perspective.
Thank you, Dr. Murray. So I will actually combine 2 questions here. They're very similar. One from Rebecca that asked, based on this data, what would be your specific policy recommendation at the state and county and municipal levels, along with Jason's question, Jason Smith, that asked, what can local governments do to improve their economic resilience, and if there are any policy recommendations?
I'll 3 quick bites. I'd say number 1, what can they do for upskilling people without a bachelor's degree? What can they do to train people to earn living wage plus and do so relatively quickly? I think that would be something to ponder. I think local decision makers have to ask, where are their economic development incentives going or not going? Are they using economic incentives to generate jobs that will up the county median or the local government median income, not to use tax breaks elsewhere? And then the third thing, I think, is celebrating victories. For example, what might happen with the South Florida Anchor Alliance in education or in healthcare, or as my colleague, Dr. Maria Ilcheva, wrote about with Victoria Lerma in small business development and manufacturing outside of tourism. Celebrate the fact that we can succeed outside of certain sectors. So that would be my trio to entertain.
Great. Okay, thank you, Dr. Frank. So I see that there are two questions from Raisa Fernandez. I will just kind of put those together. I know that we answered a little bit about what our leaders could invest or plan in terms of what our findings are and what our dashboard can do. She also mentions that we have a bond referendum that puts housing development for taxpayers. How can this be a good or bad opportunity for property owners and residents of Miami-Dade?
Well, I'm not aware, I wasn't aware of that. We are obviously aware of the bond that was approved by the voters in Palm Beach County. I didn't realize there was one being proposed in Miami-Dade County. Obviously, the city of Miami had a bond a few years ago and to address the housing needs of the city. Bonds, I think they can be effective, but they really have to be large enough to really make a difference. And then it's a question of, what types of programs would that bond money be allocated towards? And I think that's going to be the real challenge. I think some of you know that the Metropolitan Center just completed a 10-year affordable housing master plan for Broward County, where we considered a bond, but in the end, the option that we took was the use of expiring tax increment financing, and we found that was actually would be more effective, but also more in terms of its allocations, but also more cost-friendly relative to taxpayers, and obviously the payback on the bond itself. So it's not to say that a bond isn't a way to go. We have yet to see the results in Palm Beach County. That was a $200 million bond. I don't know if what is enough, but I will say this, based upon what we've learned from other locations around, not only here in South Florida, but around the country, is that if we're going to have a bond dedicated to affordable housing, it really needs to be carefully thought through in terms of how it's going to be applied to the local market. Who benefits, I think, is the big question. Who will ultimately benefit from that? And then how is it going to be leveraged? The bond, what we found in the city of Miami, when we did the master plan there a few years ago, was that the bond was just insufficient. There was $100 million. But what we thought was the bond could be really an important piece of seed capital that the city could use to leverage other types of investments. I think that's the kind of thinking that has to put forward, because anything less than a $500 million bond, but even upwards of that amount, we need to figure out how is that going to be invested, how is that going to be leveraged. But it's something that needs to be discussed, because there just isn't enough funding coming through, as I mentioned earlier, from the federal government and state. We can't expect a whole lot of additional funding in the coming years. So if we don't do it locally, I'm not quite sure how that happens. So certainly a good discussion to have at the local level.
Thank you, Dr. Murray. I see that there is a question on incorporating the issue of climate resilience into our analysis, given the importance of extreme weather events in Florida. I believe my colleague Victoria can answer that.
Yes, we did not include climate resilience in this dashboard analysis. However, speaking on extreme weather events, we do conduct an annual hurricane survey since 2006 that analyzes the preparedness and mitigation of Florida residents in coastal counties. So that will be a webinar that we will host at the end of June, and the details will follow. We hope to see you there.
Uh, I, I'd like to add, I think that part of the housing affordability crisis we're facing in South Florida, up close and personal, I would argue we get it indirectly, and the proxy is insurance. That is becoming an increasingly, we're paying 3 times the national average, and people are getting, I think, the climate effect indirectly. It's being filtered through increasingly steep insurance costs and an increasingly significant number of Floridians foregoing their property insurance or underinsuring. So I think you're seeing it as a personal finance issue that filters into the high cost of housing. It's being, I think that's in part how we are feeling it here in South Florida, Florida at large.
Sure. Thank you. So I see that there's another general question, and anyone can take this one. Can an increase in wages be a way to accommodate the increase in lifestyle?
Well, it's going to be difficult. I mean, we would like to see our core industries, leisure and hospitality, healthcare, retail, and our employers, certainly our major employers, all partake in doing what they can, because they're the ones who are benefiting from the labor force that we do have in place, and they themselves are facing labor shortages. We're hearing that every day. I'm sure many of you are, that we have severe labor shortages in certain sectors right now. So there has to be those types of levels of increase. The problem we have, though, of course, is that once again, when we're talking these core industries that make up our economic base, so out Florida, not just here in South Florida, is that they are primarily lower wage sectors. So if you're going from, you know, $20 an hour to $22 an hour, it helps, but it's certainly not going to, you know, make much of a dent in terms of your monthly housing costs and other layers of inflation that we've talked about, including food and gas, transportation, things like that. So we have to find ways to provide those opportunities in sectors that do pay higher wages, create that competition among sectors, and most importantly is provide the education and training that is needed, because then the workers themselves have more leverage in terms of the job that they seek and the mobility they have in the labor force. So all those things are really, really important. So once again, you know, the economic resiliency project and the dashboard that we'll be using, we'll be tracking this, and we'll see how individual counties are doing in that regard. Because ultimately, if we're not addressing wages, if we're not addressing diversification in terms of industry sectors, if we're not providing proper education and training, then we're not being resilient. So we will track that, and hopefully you'll all keep an eye on it as well.
Thank you, Dr. Murray. So I wanted to read out Karen's comment, thinking of housing. If workers can't afford to live where they work, how is that impacting transportation, and how might that impact job growth? I believe my colleague Alex can provide some information on that.
Yeah, I think there's kind of a short way to answer that, which is that, of course, the housing crisis is putting new and increased demands on our transportation systems. What comes to mind, first of all, is in our discussions with the Broward Metropolitan Planning Organization, they are now looking to incorporate affordable housing into their own planning, you know, such that they can try and meet the needs of our workforce via their own funding and projects. In terms of what it might mean for job growth, I think something that we've only more recently started to hear, but you might have expected, is that, yeah, this issue of where people live and work has affected recruitment and retention for low wage sectors. But now we've been hearing a lot more about lawyers and police officers and what you might consider to be high end sectors or high end occupations. Also, those jobs, it's been a struggle to fill those jobs in Florida and South Florida in particular. So I think the short answer is it's going to hinder job growth. And it's going to perhaps put new demands on our public transportation, as well as more workers are having to cross 1, 2, and 3 city boundaries just to get from home to work and back.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Alex.
and to build on what Alex just said, I think many of you know that the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provides a new process by which metropolitan planning organizations engage in a housing coordination plan with local stakeholders. And as Alex said, we worked with the Broward MPO in doing the Broward County 10-year affordable housing master plan. Here's the rub on that. What we found, not only in Broward but elsewhere, and I think many of you know this, our planning organizations, they deal with the infrastructure funds that they have and the locations they have in terms of transit hubs and transit corridors. But what we found in doing our analysis in Broward County is that the land use and zoning in place in many of these locations does not really support the level of density and even the mix of uses in terms of the critical mass that's needed, to create mixed income housing at the densities to make the numbers work. So what we would strongly suggest, and what we found, and like I said, from our own analysis, and we'll continue to work with the Broward MPO on that coordination level, is that the zoning and land use piece really needs to be focused on, because that's where municipalities come into play, because counties don't control local zoning. That's where we need to get the municipalities to understand that if we're going to be making infrastructure investments, transportation investments in your municipality, we need to make sure that your zoning and land use is compatible with what we're trying to accomplish. So that's a challenge right there. We were somewhat surprised that when we did this analysis, not only, and by the way, not only transportation centers, but also regional activity centers and local activity centers that have been designated by counties. Many of these are also transit corridor areas. But we need to make sure that if we're looking to do economic development or building transportation hub, we need to make sure that the essentials are in place, and the essentials start with the zoning and land use that needs to be there to allow for that level of density and use to occur.
Thank you, Dr. Murray. I know that we had 1 more minute, and if it's possible to provide the quickest of answer to one final question. John asks, what is the impact of cash buying houses on the availability for average income earners?
I'm sorry, was that live local, the question?
Well, it says, the question is, what is the impact of cash buying houses on the availability for average income earners?
I think I can answer that, because we have heard a lot of testimonials on that in the past year or so. And I mean, the short answer is it's created unfair competition for your median, for those households earning median incomes in any county in the state. When somebody comes and pays cash for the house, it's likely a competitive factor that they cannot meet. And so I think the answer is it's hurt the availability of homes for those earning median incomes in any county in Florida.
Thank you.
And I'll also add, there is data to support that cash buying has spiked, particularly during the pandemic, though we would need to review some of the recent data to see how that has stabilized as the market itself is stabilizing, if cash buying is still as prevalent as it was, say, a year ago or so when we first started talking about this issue.
Sure. Thank you for that very quick answer. I wanted to be mindful of everyone's time. It is 12 o'clock. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I've put the link in the chat for our website where you can reach out to any one of us with any other questions, as well as the link for the dashboard, which you all should have. Please feel free to explore. And we're here for everyone. So thank you all so much. Thank you for joining, and please have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you all.